Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today as we been putting out some thought-provoking conversations that have to do with spirituality and kind of everyday life. And today we're going to be talking about sex in the church. So joining me today is Melyssa Trussel. So Melyssa, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Scott. It's good to be here.
Yeah,
I'm
so
excited to kind of share my thoughts.
yeah, definitely. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
I am a 37-year-old current stay-at-home mom, homeschooler. I've been married for 17 years and have 4 children, ages 5 to 11. And I'm also currently a first-generation farmer. We purchased a farm a couple years ago, so that's a new adventure. My degree is in social work, and I've also spent a lot of time in full-time camp ministry and church ministry.
All right. Great. So I know when I was just kind of putting feelers out for people who want to join me on this podcast, and I mentioned sex in church, like you were one of the first ones to jump right in and say, hey, I'm having conversations with people from my church, with other moms. So definitely I like to get on this. So why do you think that this topic of sex and church life, spirituality, why do you think this is something that in some cases is things that people are now kind of discussing, talking about, and even at some point, why was this such always a taboo subject?
I know for me currently, it's because my oldest son is getting to the age where we're about to start having these kind of more important conversations regarding, his body and sexuality and things like that. And so just in conversation with other moms, we were reflecting on what, how it was discussed with us as kids and teens. And then kind of now as time has gone, what we've learned and how we might want to approach it. Some things the same, but some things differently with our own kids. And I think as a whole, it's something for a long time, I feel like that really wasn't talked about much. And now I think, at least I know for me, if the conversation is open and you're comfortable talking about it, then I think you can have more honest and real conversations with your kids. And it's about being comfortable and discussing it and not being taboo, it being okay to talk about.
So, and I would agree with you because, especially as a counselor, and sometimes when I do marriage counseling, a lot of times it's always communication. Like basically that's kind of the big thing. And communication, whether it's just regular personality things, from finances to even sex, communication has to be key in everything. So, thinking about this journey as far as teaching on sex, what was your experience of, growing up in your own home, and how did your parents ever talk to you about it? How was the experience, or was it even talked about in the home?
Well, my mom swears she talked to me about it, but I must have not been present for that conversation because I'm like, Mom, I really, truly feel like I would remember that conversation. But I think I know, like we talked about it in Girl Scouts, for example, like the biological side of things. So I can specifically learning that. And then obviously like camp and like youth camp and state youth conventions and church youth group, it was talked about in terms of a spiritual side and the church's perspective on sex, I guess. I know in my own home, like it was discussed very simply, like it's just not something you do before marriage. I feel like that was the extent of that conversation. But I know for a fact that my parents, are happily married. They've been married for almost 50 years. And I know as a teen, I was well aware that they had a happy sex life. So I was aware of it, but it just wasn't really discussed much at my house.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm trying to think about, I remember, and the idea of being not present. I'd remember the conversation my dad had with me, because I think I may have been in like maybe 6th grade, maybe 7th grade. And I remember it was almost like it came out of left field. I'm just sitting in my room, playing like a video game. My dad comes in and goes, "Hey, son, we need to talk." I'm like, "Oh, am I in trouble?" He's like, "Nope." And he goes, "Well, you're becoming a man." And right when he started talking, it was almost like I zoned completely out of that conversation. It just seemed very uncomfortable and very, I think, very awkward in some ways. Like it was like, I need to talk to my son about it, but I don't know how to approach it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it may have been with him growing up in the Nazarene church, which they were very strict as far as, no, don't go to your proms, don't go to dances, don't do
Oh,
that.
I didn't miss
So
that.
I mean, even in just socially, strict things like don't go to movie theaters because that can lead to, you know, with your girlfriend, because that can lead to this, lead to this, which eventually all leads down to sex. So maybe in some ways he felt uncomfortable because maybe it was uncomfortable. Maybe it was just kind of a generational thing.
I would agree with you. I feel like our parents' generation, it wasn't discussed much. And my mom, like, I can remember her telling me she came into marriage thinking that a condom was a bubble you got into. Like, it just literally, she didn't have even basic knowledge going into. Sorry, Mom. Sorry, I'm like sharing your secrets. Um, but I think that kind of gives perspective, though, that she just didn't have those kind of conversations. And so I don't think she or my dad really knew how to approach them with us. They grew up in very conservative homes. And, I just don't think they quite knew, kind of like your dad. It kind of came out of nowhere. I know I have to talk about this and I don't quite know how.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, it seems like, when it comes to parents and growing up, it seemed like, because again, we're very similar in age. So kind of my parents, your parents, almost like, well, we'll talk. We swear we talked to you about it, but it may be something where it was just so not like a big deal, or maybe kind of very, well, how do I approach this, that it almost kind of went in one ear out the other and it never really resonated. So take that and kind of reflect on just growing up in the church, being part of church culture. What was really the main communication on sex within church circles?
I specifically remember hearing the conversation was, you don't have sex. Like, you just don't do it, and you avoid situations that could lead to sex. And also, especially for women, you could get pregnant. Like, that was the big thing. Like, that's what it could lead to. And I don't ever remember necessarily being given specific biblical reasons why not to engage in sex before marriage. I mean, that was always the thing. Once you're married, then it's okay. Like, sex is meant for once you're married. But there wasn't a whole lot of explanation. And again, I don't know if it's people just weren't sure how to approach the subject. They weren't comfortable with it. They didn't, know how to make it relatable. I don't know. I think what you were saying earlier about the communication. And I feel like if you open a conversation with people and it's a continuous time of communication, like, you can build on things instead of like a one time, okay, this is purity weekend and we're going to talk all about it and we're never going to talk about it again. And I almost feel like that's kind of how it was. It was thrown at us and then we were done talking about it. I can specifically remember one Ohio State Youth Convention where they literally threw out, what would Jesus do boxers into the crowd for boys to wear, like, as a deterrent. Like, I don't know.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's interesting. So, I mean, within church, how was it? And you kind of talk a little bit about the boxers being thrown, again, talking about camp. And I know you and we've worked in camp ministry together.
Yeah.
And I guess it's kind of good just to kind of talk about, being a camper to being, again, a leader, leading a camp. How has that topic been handled, whether from your staff either teaching it, from counselors teaching it, or even like when we have camp pastors come and talk about it? What have you seen or experienced from? I know I'm just cracking up the whole eggs right now, so let's just get it all out there. So what was kind of your experience in seeing that?
As a camper, I don't I don't remember any specific conversations. I can remember having like maybe a class about it, like a morning session about it from staff members. Nothing's like really standing out in my mind. I know once we were directors, we tried to advise counselors not to approach the subject very much in depth, but rather to encourage campers to talk to their parents or talk to a trusted adult at home.
Mm-hmm.
Not because they weren't capable of approaching the subject, but just that we wanted to make sure campers, students were getting information that their parents wanted them to hear or that they could be followed up with. Because like we were saying, it needs to be a continual conversation. And also when you have 15 or 16-year-old counselors, they may not be the best resource for kids making tough decisions about sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, and I would agree with you, because even like, as a pastor who's kind of doing it all, I even talk to like parents and even my elder board with our teams,
Mm-hmm.
like, when should we start having this conversation? And it was
Right.
hard because, sometimes it's about, well, look at their age. Are they even interested in that topic right now? Is there any indicators that say, oh, this is something that needs to be discussed, to the point where, maybe there's some who may be 15 years old and they're asking questions and they're ready to start dating and all that. And then there's some 15-year-olds who, they're not even answering those questions or even interested in any of that things until maybe a senior in high school, or maybe when they first step on college or even decide to go into the workforce after school. So I think even when it comes to the church trying to address it, there's a lot of things. Well, you don't want to say something and be very in depth, and then some of them are going to get it, some of them are going to be very uncomfortable, and then, or you have to switch where you're so nonchalant or even not even addressing the elephant in the room sometimes, where it's like, well, it was never taught. Even I'm trying to think of my church experience, and I think the first time I've ever heard anybody talk about in detail about sex, contraceptives, STDs, pregnancy, would have been probably maybe 7th, 8th grade. And it was from Planned Parenthood. And the reason why I remember that, because the very first day this lady came in and she handed out mirrors, like in a gel, like protector with a heart on it. And it said, abstinence is freedom. And that's the first time I ever heard anyone talk about abstinence. And even talked about, and even it is very interesting because she talked about, she talked about everything, but she says, pregnancy, STDs, even contraceptives, sometimes those don't work. It's not foolproof. But if you really don't want to be pregnant, if you really don't want to have an STD, and even she even kind of talked about the psychological point of view, and even if you don't want to have to carry a weight of issues that can come with having sex early, then really the only way you're going to do that is from abstaining until you're with somebody who you really want to share that moment with, and it's someone you trust. And it was just like, okay, that was something I never heard in church. I can remember in 1996, and this might move into our next topic about purity culture, where I remember it was in Phoenix, Arizona, and I forget who the speaker was, but they handed out cards. And you had to fill out these cards, and it was one of these things where it's like, I am making a commitment. Either as a commitment or a covenant, those are two different things. At least I believe those are two different things.
I would agree.
That I am not going to have sex. I'm going to save myself for marriage. With that also being said, there's been times where, and I can't really pinpoint whether it was in a camp setting or a conference setting, but there have been times where when that idea of sexuality or sex was taught, and then the speaker would address those who may have already had sex, teens who've already had sex, there was this idea of, you can repent and become a spiritual virgin. That was always the term that was used. But then it was also kind of like, there's hope for you, but then there's almost a shame thing to it. Like, well, it's not as good as being a physical one. Like, it's almost like kind of a weird, like, shame thing. Like, here's hope for you, but it's still not as good as if you haven't had sex at all. So, so what was your experience as far as like when we talk about purity culture? Because I know that's been a big topic. I know my wife's been listening to a podcast, and that's been a topic that has been brought up. And even the guy who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua Harris, has even come out and kind of even condemned his own writing many years later. So how was purity culture explained to you, or how did that affect you growing up?
It's interesting that you mentioned both that book and like having signed something, because I was trying to think back when I saw your topic of purity culture, and I didn't read that book. And I have heard other people talk about signing something or committing to something, and I was never part of my experience. And I don't know if I just missed that conference or what, but I know purity and abstinence were discussed, and kind of like you said, in the context of that's where freedom is. You don't have the same kind of worry if you're making those choices. Here are some other options, but abstinence being the best choice is kind of what I was taught. But I didn't read that book. I don't did you read that book?
No, I didn't read any Christian dating books.
Me neither. I don't know.
And I think the reason why I never read them, because I was never interested. Like, I was interested in girls. Okay, let's set the record straight there. But I was never interested in dating, because I felt like anytime when my friends would date someone, I always thought, yeah, it would be nice, but I think I was just in a whole different world. It's like, I'm just going to be me. I'm just going to kind of live my life, and I'm not going to worry about women, which, I feel like years later, I've had conversations with people go, oh yeah, I had the biggest crush on you at camp. And I'm like, what? Like I had but I was oblivious to it, because I guess at that point, I really wasn't interested in dating at all. And I felt like anytime when dating ever was talked about to me, it usually felt like the girl had to initiate it, because I wasn't going to. And it wasn't because I was like, I'm not interested. It's just like, I guess I just wasn't interested at that time in dating. So I never read books. I never was a part of that culture.
I think I already was dating when the books came out. And I'm pretty much a rule follower. At that point in my life, I was very black and white. I lived in a very black and white world. And so I think, not that I didn't see the value in the book, but I didn't, at that point, I didn't feel like I needed it. I didn't know what it was going to teach me, I guess. So I didn't end up reading any dating books.
And I mean, and I don't know, because again, I didn't read those books. And even though I would say that I never dived into the whole purity culture thing, even though I did sign that piece of paper, which I don't know who has that piece of paper still, because that's not me. Or if they gave it to me, it's in the trash can many years later. But I know, talking with other people and even just hearing their stories, I think a lot of times with purity culture, it was not necessarily just about sex so much, but it was almost like, that idea of dating. And the reason why you are dating somebody is so that you can, and I don't know if this is because again, I didn't experience this. This is what usually females have told me, is that I'm dating somebody so that eventually I can get married. So then, sex is now, that door's now wide open. I can have sex now, but almost like that I will then be completed. That idea that, now I have fulfillment. I now have value, not necessarily that they didn't have value before, but there's almost like a cement of like now value, which, when I think about growing up going to a Christian college, I remember freshman hike, and right at the beginning, guys in one line, girls in another line. And then everyone's chanting, meet your mate, meet your mate. And that's and you're thinking that's how, and I remember thinking, this is stupid. Why am I doing this? But I did it. And I never talked to any of the girls that I had to hold hands with and talk with. But when I think about now, so far removed from undergrad now, and I've seen people who have dated someone, got engaged, and got a ring by spring, all within like 9 months. And
Mhm.
some of them, some of them are, they have kids, they have good marriages, they're still going. But then there are some who, after 4 or 5 years, they're no longer
Right.
together. They're all married different
Mhm.
people. And, there's a part of me that goes, well, did any of that have to play into some of the downfall? Or maybe or it could be unrelated, but it's one of those things where I think about, because even for me, when it comes to that, like, I was almost like, again, it almost felt like it was communicated. And maybe was that me as a teen boy, that I'm these like sexual hyper Neanderthals. So, you know, so I have to put myself in check. So even like when people would ask me, oh, do you think this person's cute? I would never answer them, because I felt like if I answered that, then that was
Mhm.
going to be, I felt like that might have been sinning in some ways. So I would never answer it. On the same token, from my perspective, seeing this, and I think maybe you could address this because this was definitely a camp thing, that when there would be the talk with all the female campers
Yes.
about their clothing attire, it
Mhm.
almost felt like, well, you have to change the way you look because these Neanderthals, all they're going to do is like slobber all over you. There's going to be like werewolves, like all that. And it's like, well, wait a minute. That's not entirely the case, but okay. Thanks for calling me a sexual Neanderthal. So,
Right.
so from the other end, from a female perspective, how would you comment on that, on everything I've just said there?
Yeah, I was thinking the things that were coming to my mind when you were referencing being at college is like a ring by spring or get your Mrs. degree, those kind of
Mm-hmm.
comments that I think are innocent, but do sometimes put pressure on women, especially, and sometimes men, to find that mate, like you said, to complete you, that you're not going to be whole until you find that person. And again, I don't think it's intentional, but it does kind of, I think it does kind of go into your subconscious and you think about that. Like, I know for me, because it was always like, you can't have sex, you can't have sex, you can't have sex. Like sex was almost painted in a negative light, and it
Mm-hmm.
became a negative thing, even though that was never, I don't think, anybody's intent.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking to camp, now again, being an adult, having my own children, kind of reflecting back on that and seeing from a guy's perspective, I know for us, it was always the 3 B's. You better have your boobs, your butt, and your belly covered.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like you said, otherwise, we're causing the men to just lose themselves, apparently.
Yeah.
And I think there's responsibility on both sides.
Yeah.
I think, like you said, it's our responsibility as individuals to make choices to keep ourselves in check, or to, with how we handle that kind of desire in our life. And I think we do have a responsibility to one another, but at the same time, you shouldn't necessarily have to compromise who you are because of what other people may or may not do, or what they may or may not think. We're responsible for each ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
but I can remember being in those conversations.
and I mean, I can remember me and your husband sitting in there, like having a meeting, talking about what we're going to do next for an evening activity because it's raining, or planning stuff, and then it's like, why are all these girls coming in here? What's going on? I have to sit in there and hear, and it made me uncomfortable just being in that room. I'm sure they felt very uncomfortable. For me, I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe John, maybe you and me should just get out of here right now and go somewhere else and have these conversations. But and again, I don't know, because when I think about the stuff that they wore, I never
Mm-hmm.
thought that, oh, the things that they're wearing were enticing. Like I definitely understood, like, me, not me, but guys wearing a Speedo, yeah, let's not do that. Yeah. Or girls not wearing a bikini, or if they do, if that's the only thing
Right.
they have, cover up. And I mean, I was perfectly fine with that. But then when you got to the point of like length of shorts, and maybe, how thick the tank top straps need to be, that was stuff that never really bothered me.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and me thinking like, because again, I used to shop at like, the Old Navies or the Pacific Sunwear back when I was a teen. And that was the type of clothing I was always exposed to. And part of me was like, well, where are you going to get your normal clothing? Because it seems like everywhere I look, it's always shorts that are short, with
Yeah.
even with the pockets kind of coming out at the edges. Um, so it's very weird. Like, well, where are they going to find clothes? Do they have to buy men's clothes to come to camp? Like, I mean, these were things that I always thought about. At the
Yeah.
same time, I would always think that, if there's guys who are girl crazy, it didn't matter what you put them in.
Right.
I mean, if they have that thing where they're just going to be obsessing over a female, if whether they were wearing a spaghetti strap tank top or they were wearing a t-shirt, it didn't
Or
matter. They were just going to be like, they're just there. So I mean, I guess in that case, I don't know what to do with that. Cause again, I was never in those meetings to make those type of decisions, and good thing I wasn't, cause I'd be like, well, it's not a big deal. Like, but I think it's it's interesting where we think how, I mean, again, like, my kids are very young, so I'm not doing, but I mean, even with my daughter, like her shorts, they're little kid shorts, so they're already short. And I'm thinking, okay, is that going to translate to when she becomes 11 or 13 or 16, is that going to be just the size that they can wear? Or does she have to wear like basketball shorts down to her knees? Because that's the only way that can cover, because I don't want to show any thigh or too much thigh, because Neanderthals are going to like start chasing after her. So when we think about all this stuff that we're talking about, how has growing up in the church, your experience at camp meetings, camps, conferences, everything else, this topic of sex, how has that shaped your view, or how has that helped or even hindered your view when it came to your own view of sex, or how that may have been discussed, or even what that looked like within your own home? Not to get too inappropriate, but how did that change, or what was that? How did you feel in those situations when you are now an adult and now that door's open? Like, how did that work for you? Not how that worked for you. I can't even think the right words. I guess, what were the positives and the negatives of that exposure?
Okay. I mean, I've definitely discussed with other women how it kind of, you literally go from like 10 minutes, a 10-minute ceremony, and now the world is open. It went from you can't do anything, it's all wrong, it's bad, don't do it, it's negative, to, oh, now you're good, you can do whatever you want as long as it's with your husband and in the context of your marriage, like everything's fine. And so trying to like reconcile that and say, okay, everything has been so bad, but now it's okay. Like it was a struggle at the beginning, like to really be comfortable with myself and be comfortable in the context of marriage, wanting to be intimate with my husband, but kind of finding that behind, like it's almost, again, that subconscious, like, this has been so negative for so long. How do I cross that bridge and kind of work through it? And I think just for us, just communication, just being honest about where we were and, kind of how things were in time. Over time, I mean, you're a married man, you know, over time, it does change. Sex within your marriage changes over time, especially having children, and there's a whole new dynamic there. It evolves.
And I would agree with you, because I even felt like, it was like, okay, married. It's like, okay, you're married, you have your wedding, you have your reception. And now what are you going to do? Like, oh, well, hey, I know what we can do, because I was told the thing I couldn't do, I can now do. So I'm going to do that. And and I would say, you've been married for 17 years. I've been married for 12 years. And I can remember, like, it was just awkward. Like, and it wasn't necessarily that what the things we're doing were awkward, but it was more just that subconscious thing, like, oh, like, what? Like, and that's the thing, because I felt like before it told you, like, man, when you wait until marriage, it's going to be wonderful. And it's like, is this wonderful? Because this is it. I don't want to even do this anymore, because it's so awkward. It also didn't help that when we got to the hotel, before we had to catch our plane to go on our cruise, that the fire alarm was going off. A kid pulled a fire alarm, and it was going off for 8 hours. We literally sat and watched, like, because the Olympics were in China, and we ended up watching the women's marathon from beginning to end, and that fire alarm was still going off. So there was nothing happening on that night. We couldn't sleep because it was like, and then it would stop. I'm like, oh, And, like, they couldn't figure out how to turn this thing off, and there's 3 fire trucks out there at the hotel. They couldn't figure out how to turn it. But again, that's just a funny story. But I felt like that's kind of how it was mentally. It just felt like
Yeah.
even when you were okay, there was these alarms going off, going, and it's like, oh well, I'm going to do this, or is it okay? And even sometimes I think it wasn't, and not only necessarily like with me, but even like with Laura, it was just like, you know, she wasn't comfortable with stuff, and it was just, and she was going through the same thing. So it's almost like rubbing sandpaper against your skin. It was just like, it was uncomfortable, and and I think it, because you felt like, well, this is so negative. I think, again, time and communication, I think that there has been more of a stride, where things that gotten worked out, where we're now communicating, we are firing all cylinders. So that when intimacy does happen in the context of sexuality, it seems to be more natural and more kind of that, you know, oh man, it's going to be great. Like when you've been hearing as a teenager, like, you know, it took like 12, almost 15 years to finally get that. And I even know other people, when they talk about, you know, when you get to like your 50s or your 60s or 70s, then it's really great. And it's like, okay, but I mean, but why is, and I guess the big question is if there wasn't that teaching that sex is wrong, it's negative, and weren't kind of communicated in a negative light, which again, like you said before, I agree with you. I don't think that was the intention of it.
Right. Yeah, I don't think so either.
I think it was more of, hey, don't have sex until you're married because of all this other stuff. But then when you add a spiritual spin on it, it's like, you know, I think even like Josh McDowell, or like some of his conferences, it's like, oh, like women, like people who have sex outside of marriage, you know, they have a higher divorce rate. And, you know, so you look at these statistics and you're like, oh, or women who have a baby, you know, they have a much more struggle, because then they're struggling to, because they're, you know, because the guy leaves and they're with the kid all by themselves, take care of it. So, you know, there's always these statistics that were, whether they're right or wrong, but I mean, it was that fear and don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And it was just, it's like you hear that and you're feeding it and you're eating that the whole entire time, that finally when everything is kosher, it's almost like, well, why is this so bad? You know?
Well, I think too, there's a reason that it's termed, you know, missionary style. And I think that the mindset of sex is painted in one light too. Like there's not, like, you're not taught to enjoy it outside of one way. You know what I'm saying? So I think it takes time in your marriage to maybe be able to loosen up, to relax, to enjoy your spouse.
Yeah.
Because it's been negative and it's taught very small. I don't know.
Yeah, very small. And I would even say that, because even like, you know, again, we kind of grew up from the same traditions as far as background in our denomination. So when I think about, you know, other people who may have grew up from like even more conservative traditions, like a Southern Baptist background, or maybe even a Lutheran background, you know, that their experience with that topic is a lot more severe, where, you know, and I don't know exactly, but I know there's some denominations where, you know, sex is specifically for having kids.
Yeah.
And then once so anything outside of baby making is still kind of seen in a negative light. I think at one point, like early Nazarene church was like that too. Like, you know, it's about, you know, it's only about having babies and stuff. And it's like, well, and again, you know, be fruitful and multiply is usually the scripture they want to use. So that's the only context. But then I always argue, like, okay, then what was David and Solomon's excuse with all their concubines? You know, like
apparently lots of babies.
Well, if it was a concubine, they can't get the throne unless it was the only male child. Then, you know, there was an exception to that rule. But I don't know. But I digress. That's an whole nother can of words I don't want to dive into. So again, so with everything we've talked about, everything we've kind of learning through this conversation, now as a mom, and now again, like you said, your son's starting to get to that age where, you know, now there's those conversations. What are some techniques that you will try to teach him, but what are some things that may kind of connect to what you've already learned or your experience? And what are some things that you're like, I'm going to completely change this thing because however I was taught was not great at all or non-existent. So what's your strategy to kind of help teach your kids about this and maybe give them a little bit better understanding or a better view than what you had growing up?
Well, I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. So, kind of looking at how am I going to approach that with my boys and how am I going to approach that with my girls? And I think for me, one of the first choices I made was I'm not going to just push off the boys on John and say, hey, they're your boys. You need to have that conversation and whatever. Like, I want to accept some responsibility for the boys and what their understanding is too. With homeschooling, I'm approaching like the biological side of it too in school, like from an educational piece. And Michael, my oldest, he's 11, and this year he's in 5th grade, and it's like the sex education year. And it's talking about the reproductive system and what the jobs of all of the reproductive organs are. And so he has a very scientific mind, and as long as I approach things with him from a very scientific perspective, he's just like, oh, okay, like he accepts it and he's good with it. But I think from more of like an emotional side, I want to be honest and real with him too, so that he is comfortable enough to approach me with questions, and not feel like John or I are closed off to questions. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces for me with my kids is starting a conversation when they're younger and keeping it open so that they know I'm comfortable talking about it. I want to talk about it with them and letting them know up front, whatever questions they have, whatever information they want, I will be as honest as I can be. Like even with choices I made and mistakes that I made in my life. And I know John too, like to us, that's an opportunity to teach them something and to help give them 2 sides of a picture sometimes as to what choices they want to make. And then also, I think you talked about like the shame sometimes that comes with it, like letting them know that, what, mistakes will be made. That's just part of being human, but that I'm not going to be angry or shame them if that happens. And that, again, I still want them to come and talk to me about it so that we can move forward and encourage them in the choices that they're making. And obviously, I know that I will teach abstinence in my home because I feel like it is important. I feel like not making that choice until you are in a marital relationship is good because I think it really does better your marriage. You're not bringing in baggage that you then have to deal with as a married couple. And also it allows you to have first-hand experiences with your spouse that you haven't had before. Like you get to experience all of that with the person you've committed your life to. And so, but at the same time, making sure that I paint a positive picture of what sex is and telling them that the reason they shouldn't is not because it's bad or wrong, but because it was designed to be enjoyed by committed people. So
yeah. And I would agree with you about, just making sure you're open and honest, having that conversations, even let them know, hey, I am here to talk to you. So even if you are, jonesing, or you switched over to Neanderthal mode, or whether you have made mistakes, or maybe maybe boundaries did get pushed a little bit.
right.
Talk to us. Let's unpack it. Let's process this. Let's discuss it in a very open platform. I think what you said was also good too, because I think even when I think about my dad touching me, I don't think my mom ever had that conversation with me. It was almost like, boys be boys, girls be girls, and that's how it is. And I think when it comes, if I'm always teaching my clients or the couple doing premarital counseling, and I'm telling them that it's communication, well, then when it comes to teaching about sex, there has to be communication. And I think that's why now where I think even before, when you look at some of the older videos on like church instructional videos about sex, and, usually it would be like one person, whether it be a guy or be a female, but now you're seeing that there's couples talking about it. Like I think recently, like I was looking at just some marriage stuff, and it seemed like almost everything through like Right Now Media was a couple was talking about it, couple. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. But at the same time, it makes sense because, you know, when you're having that
Absolutely.
dialogue, you need to have
Perspectives.
both perspectives and participants in that. And I think
Mhm.
especially when it comes to, and my whole theology as far as like church teachings, especially, you know, a lot of that has to be in the home, you know,
Mhm.
especially, you know,
Absolutely.
even when it comes to personal devotion, you know, again, you know, if kids are in the home for 24 hours, 7 days a week, you know, I only have an experience with them, maybe 1 or 2 hours a week.
Right.
Same
Absolutely.
thing with adults too, 1 or 2 hours a week, maybe more if they're coming to extracurricular activities at the church. Um, so when it comes to teaching on anything, but more importantly, sex, you know, it has to be with the parents. And I think the
Mhm.
best way the church can do is, should the church not teach on sex? I think they should. At some point, they need to talk to
Right.
that, whether it's in open form, like in a normal Sunday morning conversation, or within like a teen setting. But at the same time, I also think that it needs to be discussed in the home, or have
Mhm.
materials at church provide opportunities or materials for that, to be able to have those conversations, to be able to
Well, I
have
think,
that
yeah,
freedom.
empowering parents, like
Hmm.
letting them know that this is an okay thing to talk about. It's a good thing to talk about. You know,
Yeah.
don't be afraid of the topic. And I think you mentioned earlier, sometimes with youth, you notice, okay,
Hmm.
it's time to have this conversation, and that's maybe when the church can approach it, or you know,
Hmm.
you as a pastor or youth pastor can approach that subject when you're seeing the need for it to happen. But I 100% agree with you. Like, you know, to me, the church is supplemental to my child rearing. Like,
Hmm.
biblical teaching begins at home. That is something that's important to us. We do on a daily basis. I can't
Hmm.
expect the church to take care of that for me.
Yeah.
Um, and I know some people don't feel as confident in teaching scripture, or don't feel as confident in their relationship. Maybe they're newer to Christianity, and so they do rely more on the church.
Hmm.
But hopefully, you know, they do take those conversations into their home. And I think too, just helping our children understand why, like helping my girls understand why modesty is important. Like, is it the distance of, is your spaghetti strap 2 inches across or two fingertips? Does that really matter? No, it's about being respectful of your body and taking care of your
Hmm.
body and being respectful of others. That's what it comes down to, not how long your shorts are or how wide your tank top straps are.
Yeah.
It's modesty. And
Hmm.
so,
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, Melissa, for joining me on this conversation. I think it's been a very informative conversation to talk about our experiences and kind of how our experiences shape on how we're going to teach the
yeah.
next generation, more specifically in the home. Is there anything that we haven't talked about or haven't covered that you think needs to be addressed?
Nothing
Okay, that's
specific.
fine. I always ask that question because sometimes it might be like, oh yeah, you know, I need to talk about this, or here's where I'm hearing my mom friends talking about.
I was trying to think if there was anything specific. I mean, a lot of the things I heard are similar to my experience, you know, trying to overcome the negative side of things, or, you know, having a mom tell me, they never told me why. They always told me not to do it, but no one ever told me why.
Mm-hmm.
And I can even specifically remember having like one mentor in my life who, when I got engaged, was specific and came to me and felt like she could have a one-on-one conversation and said, hey, look, now that you're engaged, you know, don't see this as an opportunity to kind of let go of what, you know, the purity you've held on to. Like,
Mm-hmm.
see it through to your marriage, because I feel like that's important. And so that is probably one of only a few conversations I had directly with a mentor or an adult. And I thought that was interesting, kind of reflecting on this once you kind of brought up the topics. But
Yeah. All
um,
right. Well, again, Melissa, thank you so much for joining me on
you're
this
welcome.
podcast, and everybody else who's been listening. Thank you so much for listening to us. Again, if you like this podcast, you can go ahead and like, share, and even subscribe to my podcast on any podcast platform. You can also comment and leave comments or questions on my website, thescottstedman.com. We'd like to hear what you think, or even hear about your experiences growing up and how sex was taught in your home or within your community, religious communities. All right. And again, Melyssa, thank you so much for joining. I hope all of you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.